Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling forgotten stories from British history. Now, if you're looking for a classic action film about the 19th century British Empire, then you probably can't beat Zulu. But for me, a very close second is the 1966 film Khartoum, starring Charlton Heston and Laurence Olivier, which tells the story of General Charles Gordon and the war with the Mahdi in Sudan. Now, those fans of Zulu, or those of you who watched or listened to my episode about it, will know that that film historically has a fair few holes in it, despite being a great film. So what about Khartoum? How close to the real events does that film get? Let's find out. Released in 1966, Khartoum was filmed on location in Egypt and starred Charlton Heston as Charles Gordon and Laurence Olivier as the Mahdi. It was one of the last epic action films centred on the British Empire before the subject became unfashionable. Zulu had been released just 2 years earlier, with 55 Days in Peking, also starring Heston, and Lawrence of Arabia just before that. And rather like the Victorian British Empire, the film is of its time. I doubt you'd get away with blacking up Olivier as the Mahdi nowadays. On the other hand, it does not portray the Mahdi or his supporters as baddies fighting goodies. Rather like in Zulu, whilst not telling the story from a non-British side, characters do try to explain to the audience some of the nuances of what was really going on. For instance, in the film, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, played by Richard Johnson, tells the British cabinet that the main reason that the Mahdi's peasant army could defeat an Egyptian army equipped with the latest weapons was because the latter were merely fighting for money, whereas the Mahdi's followers were fighting a holy war. He continues that Prime Minister Gladstone and his cabinet are making a grave mistake, believing that they're fighting an ignorant savage. Those were his words in the film. The Mahdi, Stewart says, is the most extraordinary man Sudan has ever seen. And above all, he knows his people. What makes it even more different from modern films and even films at the time is that there's no love story. Indeed, there are no female characters whatsoever. Not even Queen Victoria makes an appearance. It merely seeks to tell the story of General Charles Gordon and his death at Khartoum. And as a war film depicting the 19th century British Empire and filmed nearly 60 years ago, it is a ripping yarn. Which still leaves the question, how close to the real events does it get? Or does it simply get the loosely based upon Hollywood treatment? Let's find out. Charles George Gordon was born near London in 1833, the son of a senior army officer. In 1852, he was commissioned in the Royal Engineers, with whom he served in the Crimean War at the Siege of Sebastopol. Promoted to captain, in 1860 he volunteered to serve in the Second Opium War against China, but arrived too late to see any action. However, China was in the throes of a vicious and bloody civil war, the Taiping Rebellion. Gordon was seconded to command a militia charged with defending areas close to Shanghai and its international trading community. With this militia, which he renamed the Ever-Victorious Army, he notched up a number of successes, to the extent that the Chinese emperor presented him with a yellow imperial jacket. It signified the highest honour that the emperor could give, and Gordon was one of a handful of Westerners ever to be thus recognised. Back in Britain, the press quickly dubbed him Chinese Gordon. A man bored with peacetime military duties, in the 1870s he accepted an offer from the Caliph of Egypt to serve in their colony of Sudan, where he was eventually appointed Governor-General. His attempts to eradicate the Arab slave trade led to a rebellion by slave owners, which he successfully put down before resigning in 1879. During the next few years, Egypt came under British domination. But whilst the Egyptians were coming under British domination, they themselves were faced with a revolt against Egyptian rule in the Sudan. In 1881, a former boatmaker and mystic, Mohammed Ahmed, burst onto the scene. He proclaimed himself to be the Mahdi, the guided one, who would herald the end of days and the ultimate victory of Islam. His end of days prophecy and anti-Egyptian messages electrified the country, and thousands flocked to his banner. The Egyptian Caliph sent a huge army south to confront the Mahdi, commanded by a former British officer, Colonel William Hicks. Armed with modern Remington rifles and accompanied by Krupp's artillery, his army of 10,000 proved no match for the supporters of the Mahdi, often called dervishes. In November 1883, the whole army of Hicks Pasha was wiped out. It was blatantly obvious to the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Evelyn Baring, that Egypt's empire in Sudan was finished. This was confirmed by a British Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Stewart, who had been sent to Khartoum to report on the situation and reported back to the government in London. The Khedive now pleaded with the British to help him out before the Mahdist revolution swept into his own country. For the British, Sudan held no strategic or economic value. However, they did value the Suez Canal in Egypt, and the last thing they wanted was the Mahdi anywhere near it. So, what to do? The best policy, advised High Commissioner Baring, was to get all Egyptian troops, civilians and other foreigners out of Sudan, leave the country to the Sudanese, and then strengthen Egypt's own defences on her southern border. It was something that British Prime Minister Gladstone concurred with, even telling the House of Commons that the Mahdi and his supporters were fighting for their freedom. But how could the evacuation of thousands of people in the face of an Islamic revolt be done without dragging Britain into a costly and bloody conflict? In the film, it was the British Foreign Secretary who announces, "Send Chinese Gordon." In reality, this battle cry had already been shouted in the British press, not least by the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, W.T. Stead, who interviewed Gordon on the 9th of January 1884. Gladstone, played in the film by Ralph Richardson, was not so sure. He was suspicious of Gordon going off script. As he said in the film, he treats a military order as if it were a birthday greeting. He also distrusted Gordon's evangelical Christian faith. In the film he says, "I trust no man who consults God before he consults me." Whilst there is no record of that particular comment, it is a fair reflection of Gladstone's wariness of Chinese Gordon. Nevertheless, despite those concerns, it was a lot less dangerous than sending a whole army, and on the 18th of January 1884, Gordon left England for Khartoum. His role? To proceed to the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, and supervise the evacuation of its Egyptian garrison and civilians. He was accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, who was now appointed as his aide-de-camp, ADC. Arriving in Egypt a month later, he was taken by the British High Commissioner, Baring, to meet the Khedive. The Egyptian ruler now made him Governor-General of the Sudan once more, and gave him a secondary brief to establish a secure form of government in Sudan. Now, quite how he could do that whilst evacuating the Egyptian military is an interesting conundrum, not to mention an interesting deviation from the orders given to him by the British government. But in fact, Gordon actually attempted to square this circle. He had someone lined up to become governor after he had overseen the evacuation, a former slave trader by the name of Zebir Pasha. Banished by Gordon when he was previously Governor-General for leading that revolt against the abolition of slavery, Zebir Pasha was now residing under house arrest in Cairo. If there was a local Sudanese who could potentially rival the Mahdi with charisma, cunning and patriotism, here was the man. Just as in the film, Gordon, accompanied by Baring and Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, went to Zebir's house in an effort to persuade him to take up this role. But Gordon had completely misread his man. The Sudanese man, dubbed by the British press as a slave king, not only bore him a grudge for having had him detained under house arrest in Cairo for the last, 5+ years, but also for executing his son. And just as in the film, Zebir Pasha refused to play ball. And even if he had, Gordon would have had to have convinced the British government, and there was no way that the Liberal government, which was deeply aligned to Britain's own anti-slavery movements, was going to sanction a well-known and unrepentant slave trader to take over the reins of government in Sudan. Despite that setback, Gordon now proceeded up the Nile, arriving at Khartoum on the 18th of February. Situated at the point where the Blue and White Niles meet and then flow as one mighty river down to Egypt, the capital of Sudan had been established in the 1820s. By the time of Gordon's arrival, the city's population had swelled to 34,000 as refugees fleeing the Mahdist revolt flocked to its safety, and also inside the city were 7,000 Egyptian troops. Gordon Pasha was treated to an enthusiastic welcome. Many had not forgotten the efforts he had made to abolish slavery. It is now that the film makes a major departure from historical fact. Gordon, accompanied by his servant, journeys by camel to the Mahdi's camp to parley. The two men having a verbal duel is great cinema, but it never happened. In fact, Gordon and the Mahdi, whilst corresponding, never ever met. Well, back to facts. Gordon did evacuate over 2,000 civilians and about 500 Egyptian troops downriver. If not perfect, things in Khartoum were at least looking positive. But that was all about to change. 2 weeks before Gordon's arrival in Khartoum, another Egyptian army, under yet another former British officer, Valentine Baker, had been defeated by Mahdist warriors on the Red Sea coast. With another PR disaster involving a former British officer and a potential evacuation route for Gordon now blocked, Gladstone reluctantly diverted a British force sailing home from India to the Sudanese coast under Major General Graham. In the next month, his British soldiers defeated the Mahdists at the Battle of El Teb and Tamai. But Graham's victories did not change the course of the revolt. His force of 4,500 was in no position to turn back the Mahdist tide, even if the government in London had wanted them to. And they didn't. That was exactly the kind of commitment Gladstone was trying to avoid by sending Gordon on his one-man mission. Having saved face, London ordered Graham to re-embark and continue his journey back to England. If the British had thought that the presence of redcoats in eastern Sudan would blunt the Mahdist revolt or give Gordon a window of opportunity, they were horribly mistaken. The presence of white Christian soldiers galvanised the Sudanese. Tribes hitherto neutral now came over to the Mahdi, and that had implications for Gordon in Khartoum. Even before Graham had departed, both the road from Berber to Khartoum and the telegraph line between Shendi and Berber had been cut. From now on, Gordon would have to rely on steamships to keep him in touch with the outside world. And along that mighty river, communities were switching their allegiance to the Mahdi, meaning that even these trips would involve running gauntlets, rifle fire, and limited safe ports for resupplying fuel and food. To all intents and purposes, he was now cut off, hundreds of miles from safety. The British press highlighted the situation and demanded action. Meanwhile, what was the situation in Khartoum itself? Gordon had been using his engineering expertise to fortify the town. Ramparts were reinforced and barbed wire strung out in front of them. Mines were laid in the desert approaches to the south of the town. And most impressive, he ordered a huge 6-mile ditch to be dug connecting the Blue and White Niles to the south of the city. The film captures the dramatic moment when the barrier holding back the Nile was pulled away and the ditch is flooded, turning Khartoum into a part natural, part man-made island. There was, however, an Achilles heel in his defences. At the western end of his ditch, before it reached the White Nile, the ditch ran into mudflats. When the river was high, these flats added even more of a barrier to any attacker. But when the floodwaters fell, the advantage would then swing to the attackers, as it would leave an unexposed and undefended riverbank. That aside, Gordon now organised expeditions far into the countryside to collect as much food as possible to support any siege that the Mahdi might try to impose. This is featured in the film, although, just to make it more dramatic for cinema goers, Charlton Heston personally leads the foraging expedition and fends off an attack by Mahdist cavalry. In reality, Gordon had remained in the city, but the film did need some action scenes with its star, didn't it? By now, the clamour in Britain to do something was getting louder and louder. The British public were demanding that the Prime Minister do something to save Gordon. Of course, the easiest thing was for Gordon to sail down the Nile on a steamer and leave Khartoum to its fate. But that was not in Gordon's playbook. He'd been asked by the Khedive to sort out the government of the Sudan, and with no conciliation with the Mahdi or Hicks Pasha, he felt the only option was to stay and somehow sort it out himself. Maybe, as Gladstone suspected, he believed that the British would be forced to send an army to save him, and in the process defeat the Mahdi, which was exactly what Gladstone had always been wary of. But the public and political pressure was growing. Finally, on the 25th of July, 1884, the Cabinet voted against Gladstone's wishes to send a relief column to rescue the darling of the British public from Khartoum. 10 days later, the House of Commons approved a budget to finance this expedition. Command of this relief expedition was given to General Sir Garnet Wolseley, Britain's military hero of the day. Now, in the film, he's played by Nigel Green, who stole the show as Colour Sergeant Bourne in the film Zulu. For all his self-publicity as the very model of a modern Major General, Wolseley was a cautious commander. The fastest way for Wolseley to get to Khartoum and save Gordon was to land a force on the Red Sea coast and then race 250 miles across the desert to Berber. From there, it was just 200 miles up the river to Khartoum. However, Wolseley opted for a safer but longer route, all the way up the Nile from Egypt, 4 times the distance, but allowing access to far more water, less harsh desert conditions, and avoiding the Mahdist warriors near the coast. It would cost valuable time, especially as Wolseley wasn't exactly moving particularly quickly. Now, whether he was under orders to avoid battling the Mahdists until he really had to, or whether he felt that his hero, Gordon, would prevail, is one of those hotly debated points. Meanwhile, in Khartoum, Gordon was getting increasingly frustrated that there was no sign of any relief column. In desperation, he decided to send Lieutenant Colonel Stewart downstream in search of Wolseley. This event is also captured in the film. Stewart carried confidential papers from the Governor-General outlining the dire situation, that by mid-November the food will have run out, and then it was just a matter of weeks before Khartoum fell. In the film, he also gives Stewart his signet ring, and we'll come back to that in a while. On the 9th of September, Stewart left on the steamship Abbas, accompanied by the Times correspondent, Frank Powell, the French consul, and 18 Greek refugees. Contrary to the film, there were no European women as passengers. In order to give Stewart a fighting chance of getting past the Mahdist forces at Berber, Gordon also placed 50 soldiers on the boat. And off it sailed. Exactly a month later, a young boy was brought before him with some alarming news. The Mahdi was on the march. The 21st of October marked the new year of 1302 in the Arab calendar. Whether by pure luck or design, it was on this day that the Mahdi arrived across the river from Khartoum. Meanwhile, Wolseley was still at Wadi Halfa, 600 miles downriver. A river whose levels were now falling. The following day, Gordon received a letter from the Mahdi urging him to convert to Islam and be spared the coming wrath. Once more in the film, Gordon meets the Mahdi, who now dropped a bombshell. In the film, the Abbas successfully runs the gauntlet of fire at Berber, but loses 2 boats carrying supplies of wood for her boilers, thus implying that they ran out of fuel. During their meeting in the film, the Mahdi opens some barrels and pulls out the heads of the Times correspondent and the French consul. Finally, he fishes out Lieutenant Colonel Stewart's hand, complete with Gordon's ring on it. The truth was a lot less melodramatic. In reality, the steamer did pass Berber, but then hit rocks near Abu Hamad, and the passengers and soldiers were killed when they floundered ashore. Rather than playing lucky dip in barrels, the Mahdi proved his point about the Abbas by sharing his knowledge of all the documents that the boat had been carrying in his letter to Gordon. In that letter, he itemised every document and provided a précis of each. Very definite proof that he had them in his possession and that the Abbas had been captured. The next 3 months as the Mahdists moved from blockade to full-blown siege were marked by increasingly frequent mood swings in Gordon. Suddenly, on the 3rd of November, a steamship managed to run the ever-increasing gauntlet of rifles and artillery along the river, bringing a message from Wolseley. Unfortunately, Wolseley's message was in code, and Gordon had given his ciphers to Stewart. However, another message from a certain Major Kitchener was not in code. He confirmed that the Abbas had been captured and all on board killed. And thus, Gordon's desperate messages to Wolseley that Stewart had been carrying had not been received. No wonder the general seemed to have no sense of urgency. In desperation, on the 14th of December, Gordon wrote a brief note to Wolseley on a piece of paper the size of a postage stamp. It read, "Khartoum all right." He gave it to a messenger who slipped out of the city on a camel and raced north across the desert. That messenger had memorised a very different message. All livestock, even camels, had been consumed, and starvation was taking hold in Khartoum. If relief didn't arrive soon, it was all over. The real situation was confirmed when Gordon, as per the film, opened the city's southern gate and allowed nearly half the population to leave and make their peace with the Mahdi. At least Gordon now had less mouths to feed. Wolseley received the messenger on the 2nd of January 1885. Despite having landed over 3 months ago, he was still 300 miles downriver from Khartoum. Realising the dire situation and his own helpless position, he ordered a flying column to take a 160-mile shortcut across the desert to Metemma further up the Nile. Its size meant that it couldn't relieve Khartoum, but he hoped it might force the Mahdi to back off. It would have the opposite effect. Having beaten off determined attacks from the Dervish army at both Abu Klea and Abu Kru, the flying column eventually reached the Nile near Metemma, but only after losing their commander and second-in-commands in those battles. At the Nile, they were met by Gordon's steamers, which had been sailing up and down patiently waiting for the relief column for the last 2.5 months. Sir Charles Wilson, now acting commander of the flying column, set sail on the 5-day journey to Khartoum on the 23rd of January. Now, contrary to the film, where massed ranks of khaki-clad British soldiers embarked, in reality, thanks to Wolseley's orders, the only troops that accompanied him were 20 redcoats from the Sussex Regiment. His orders were to assess the situation and under no circumstances land, unless Gordon signalled that he wanted to be rescued. The rest of the troops would wait for Wolseley's main expedition, still lumbering up the Nile. The heavy losses at Abu Klea and Abu Kru had rattled Mohammed Ahmed, the Mahdi. He decided to attack Khartoum before the British got any closer. In the early hours of the 26th of January 1885, his army silently moved into place. The attack came just after 3 a.m, although in the film the whole battle is fought in daylight. However, the film does correctly show that by now the ditch was dry. While it focuses on the attack on one of the gates, in reality, whilst that did happen, the main breakthrough occurred as the Mahdi's forces raced across the dry mud flats and into the city, that Achilles heel that I'd mentioned earlier. Gordon's defending army, demoralised and severely weakened by malnutrition, was simply overwhelmed by the Dervish attackers. Within an hour, thousands of Mahdi's warriors were inside the city. Almost the entire garrison and thousands of civilian men were killed. Total estimates range from between 7,000 to 10,000. Many women and girls were carried off into slavery or forced marriages. The film now reaches its climax. In the governor's palace, General Charles Gordon, refusing his sword from his servant Cahill, appears at the top of the staircase just as the Mahdi's warriors are about to surge up. For a moment, time stands still as Charlton Heston stares them down. It's almost a carbon copy of the 1893 painting by George William Joy entitled Gordon's Last Stand. That very title reflects the masculine Christianity that was the bedrock of the late Victorian British Empire. A Christian martyr armed only with his cane, facing the forces of Islam. And then in the film, a warrior throws a spear into his chest. Gordon falls to his death. And yet, was that how he died? One of his bodyguards told the British in the 1890s that he saw Gordon firing a revolver and then, when it was empty, drawing his sword before finally being speared in his right side. Some of the Mahdi's warriors said that he was shot whilst fighting his way to the Austrian consulate, a story repeated by his biographer, General Sir William Butler. Both of these accounts are far less mystical than confronting his enemies on the stairs armed by his cane, but are possibly more in keeping with a military man who'd fought in China and Crimea. Who knows? Interestingly, his servant, Cahill, claimed that Gordon did die on the steps. He himself was knocked unconscious as the Dervish warriors attacked the general there, and when he came around, he found himself lying next to Gordon's body, riddled with bullet wounds, and minus its head. Which may be true, because Gordon's head was certainly taken to the Mahdi's tent in Omdurman. In the film, the Mahdi appears shocked and cries, "I forbade it!" Indeed, he had ordered that Gordon be taken alive, But in the heat of battle, his immediate subordinates had little chance of controlling thousands of their fired-up warriors. In the film, the Mahdi then shouts, "Take it away!" and we never know what happened to it, or indeed his body. In reality, he ordered the head to be placed on a pole so that children could throw stones at it, and the vultures could feed on it. Not quite as charitable as Laurence Olivier. Some later accounts from Mahdi's warriors then said that his head and body were tossed into the Nile. 2 days later, the convoy of steamers under Sir Charles Wilson came up the Nile to be greeted by the sight of thousands of Mahdi's warriors in the town. Khartoum had fallen, Gordon was dead, and the relief expedition was too late. So there you are, General Charles Gordon, the reality versus the film Khartoum. Personally, I think the film stays pretty close to the truth. Probably the most glaring error being the non-existent meetings between Gordon and the Mahdi. What do you think? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Apart from the port of Suakin and a few forts on the border with Egypt and the isolated southern province of Victoria under Emin Pasha, the whole of Sudan was now under the control of the Mahdi. It would be 13 years before the British avenged his death, when an Anglo-Egyptian army, led by the now General Kitchener, defeated the Mahdi's successor at the Battle of Omdurman. And I've told that story about Omdurman, along with the battles of Abu Klea, the Nile expedition to rescue Gordon, and General Graham's battles on the Red Sea coast, not forgetting the rescue of Emin Pasha down in the south, in previous episodes. So why not check them out in a moment? Thanks to all my patrons and members, in particular Charlie Manson, Jonathan Townsend, Harvey Tyler and Shubhanka. Details on how you can support me are in the description below. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.